Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here. So glad to be joining you. And I have David Kinnaman here with me, president of the Barna Group. David, good to connect. And we're going to be talking about small groups.
Yeah. Hey, Carey, good to see you, man. How's your summer going?
It's been great. I took a whole month off. I mean, we worked ahead on this show and you pinch hit a little bit and others did. And it was amazing, man. It was really good. And I didn't cheat. That was the most surprising part. I didn't like sneak in that half hour of email every morning or start texting my team while I was at the beach. It was just a real break and it was good. How about you?
Good for you. Same. Well, I'm doing a little bit of work. I haven't blocked out as much time, but I've had a lot of significant time off over the last 9 months, 10 months since my wife's passing. And I feel like I'm in this sort of year of rebuilding and sort of rethinking some things, but I've had a lot of great time with my family, a lot of fun trips, a lot of great food. And my summer's going really well. And I'm proud of you for not cheating. That's a hard thing to do.
It was hard. I think I told her that I'm going to write about this, but I think maybe I did an hour of work in the whole month. We had one thing come up. We had a staff member announce that they were transitioning, which was great. So they're moving on to Life Church, which is amazing. So I jumped in for that. But that was about it. And it was great. So if I wasn't managing the never-ending renovation project in my backyard, I might have had a real break. But that's not on work. That's on my life. So
yeah. Well, I feel like in the pandemic, it's something we're seeing with a lot of leaders, isn't it? That the pandemic has taken so much out of everyone. And especially among church leaders, it's been such a tough row to hoe. And I feel like it's a good lesson for all of us that breaks and, realizing we're not at the center of all of this, that we really can't control the outcomes around us. The best we can do is just, keep ourselves together during this crazy time.
God has been teaching me patience. And, the other thing for those of us, and I know a lot of our listeners have been open for a year, they're like, pandemic, what pandemic? Others are still in lockdown. If you're in Australia, New Zealand, you're in the UK, it's more sketchy. Canada's been a little late to open, but I have been out for the last 6-7 weeks seeing all the people I have missed locally. And it's been amazing, like getting together yesterday or the day before. Our small group leaders have been friends for years, and we went on a bike ride together in like the first group ride post-COVID. It was so much fun. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit today, right? We're going to talk about small groups, community, Zoom versus real life. And I'll tell you, David, you got out of lockdown a lot sooner than I did, but my goodness, it's good to see people again.
It is. And then of course there's the challenges of the Delta variant, and in California, certain counties are closing back up again, and there's sort of modified mask restrictions, I should say. So depending on where you live, what community you live in, and then just sort of other places, like you said, it will feel like the pandemic is like distant memory. But I think this question for us, I saw this on Twitter today. This idea of like the challenges pastors have faced, and it's something we've come back to often in this podcast. The challenges that pastors have faced in this last year and a half have been significant, even if you're in a place where the pandemic wasn't as sort of either front and center, or the restrictions came off earlier. It's like there's this complete reset of the way people are thinking about life and leadership. And so, again, just encouraging to listeners here as you're leading on, just take the time. Like, the work is going to be there. It's going to be there next week. It's going to be there next month. It's going to be there next year. Do what you need to do to love on your family, take care of yourself, do the things that you need to do to get yourself as whole as you possibly can.
That's great advice. I would say too, because I have met with a number of pastors over the last month too in person, and just hearing the stories, nobody really knows what's left of their church, right? Even if you've been open for a while, very few churches are back to 100%. And those that are reopening have been open for a few months. It's like, it's kind of uphill with volunteers. And the thing on my heart is just love what you've got, like to mourn for what it used to be, to beat yourself up every day because it's not 2019. I talked to one leader, we had it too at Connexus, lots of momentum heading into 2020. We're still at capacity restrictions, but we're reopened in person. And you got to love what you got. You got to embrace the season that God has you in. And that can be really hard at times. But I think if you mourn for the past, for sure, grieve your losses, like Terry Wardle said on this podcast. But once you're through that, like, okay, this is a new day and a new church, and I've got a new reality, and here we are. And what do we make of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, So many good things to talk about. It's good to see you. It's been too long. I'm glad you had a good month off.
But I think in person is maybe, depending on Delta, probably in the works this fall, which is good. I'm going to cross the border, God willing, in the next month. So there we go. We'll see what happens.
Quick, alert the Border Patrol.
Yeah. You have time. You can stop this now if you still want to, David.
That's great.
Anyway, yeah. So what are your thoughts on groups, hybrid and in-person? I just got to say too, I've written a lot about digital church. I'm a fan of digital church, but being in the room, I cried through the first 2 songs. I didn't expect I would. I was excited to be back, but like it was very emotional. And just seeing people, like you kind of have your bubble, right? We were in it for about a year, but then like I actually got together with like random friends I wouldn't normally see, and we're definitely not part of my bubble. And everything just seems sweeter and better. So yeah, there is something about in person, but I think digital is a great front door and side door. I'll stick by that, but it is no replacement for in person.
No doubt. I felt the same experience when I went back to church for the first time in May in person. And so, yeah, I think we want to talk today about small groups and some of the things that we're seeing in the research. And, we know a couple of key facts coming out of some data we collected in late spring, early summer. But for example, 78% of adults who are churchgoers agreed that experiencing God in a church service alongside others in person is very important to them. So 3 out of 4 people, 75% said that they had attended church digitally, agreed of those who attended church digitally agreed that when they attend church digitally, they feel connected to their church community. So that speaks to what you just said. There's this real longing for in-person among most churchgoers, but most people are saying they do feel connected on some basis with digital. And then in particular, we'll talk about small groups today. And I think one of the zoom out comments that we could make is that, small groups were both kind of the best of times, the worst of times over the last year and a half. I think in a lot of ways, my assessment is that small groups and the kind of the ability to do smaller gatherings in groups was one of the things that really helped the church get through some of the toughest days of the pandemic. But they also revealed, I think the pandemic revealed the weakness of small group strategy as it's currently built. And so I think there's like we saw so much in the data that a lot of churches didn't use small groups as much as they would have liked, that small groups weren't as strong and resilient as they could have been in many churches. And so I think there's this really interesting kind of juxtaposition of, both the fact that small groups were very important, but they were also sort of they were less ready, and what structures in our churches were ready. Very few of them on some basis, certainly not our main stage sort of worship services were ready for the shift to digital, but small groups, which we say should be able to work in kind of any environment at any time, weren't always as effective as I think they could be. So I think we're at this great moment in the church where we can sort of reimagine all of these kinds of practices, whether we're talking about youth ministry or children's ministry or, sort of worship settings or the digital in-person hybrid models. And that's, I think, something we're really excited today to talk about in terms of small groups. How can we get the most out of this moment?
Yeah, I'm very excited for that. And the other thought that occurred to me while you're talking is it could be wobbly for a little while. I think about my own small group, David, and that whole metaphor, I think Dave Ferguson talked about it here, red light, yellow light, green light people. That might be the case for a little bit longer. Delta variant being a play and other variants apparently will come along. And there are some people who are like, yep, I'm here, mask off, fully vaccinated, ready to go. Then there are other vaccine hesitant people who are not as ready. Then there are people who are honestly probably not going to come out for a while. Right. And so we're in this kind of in-between space. And I'm glad that Bill and Andy updated their book about creating community, about small groups. So we'll talk about that. And we're excited to have Bill Willits with us. He's the Executive Director of Adult Ministry Environments for North Point Community Ministries, one of the founding staff members. He's a graduate of DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary, and he and his team have connected more than 50,000 adults into small groups. So he knows a thing or two about that. And then Libby Hempen is the Director of Women's Groups at the Gwinnett campus of North Point Ministries, where she gets to recruit, train, and support small group leaders. She's been in her current role about 7 years and on staff for 15. So let's welcome Bill and Libby. Well, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you both.
Great to be with you.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having us.
Great. Well, Bill, you recently republished, or better yet, rewrote a book called Creating Community. I read it when it first came out. What was that? 2004, five,
Five.
six,
Yeah, it was around
five.
2005. Isn't that crazy?
Wow. So 16 years ago.
Yeah,
And you wrote it with Andy Stanley. And obviously, a lot had changed before we had COVID. But I'd love to know, because the pandemic has been a huge accelerator of change. What changes in the culture have you seen in group culture and the way the church gathers over the last 15 years, now accelerated by a pandemic?
sure. Well, you got it right. A lot has changed in 16 years. As awful as COVID was on multiple levels for so many people, it really turned out to be the great relational reveal of
Hmm.
how isolated and disconnected so many people really are. In fact, I saw one report that loneliness was already on an epidemic before the pandemic, because right before COVID hit, Cigna, which is a large global health organization, conducted a survey of 20,000 people, and it was a global survey. Came back and found out that nearly half of the people reported sometimes or always felt alone. Another half of those people have only half of them had meaningful or in-person social contacts on a daily basis. And then here was the kicker, Carey. Gen Z, they concluded, was the loneliest generation and claims to be in worse health than older generations like ours.
Oh, wow.
So loneliness was already an epidemic, and then we got hit by a pandemic, and it just made things measurably worse. But in response to your question about cultural changes over the last few years, we've had a lot of them when you think about what's happened in culture over 16 years. And some of those changes, what they've really done is they've had significant implications on people's ability to meaningfully connect with other people. For example, consider just these two changes that have happened over the last 13 years: technology and smartphones. 13 years ago, nobody had a smartphone. Today, over 80% of the population has them. Now, they got some benefits to it, always accessible and available, but the challenges is that we're always accessible and available, right? I mean, they become all-consuming. And the potential implications are that we get distracted, so we have a hard time being fully present with anybody around us. Sure, they change the way that we work and that we play, but we all know, and we've all been guilty of the fact that smartphones can actually make us act relationally dumb, and serve to be a major distraction for us and our families. In fact, our family, we had to go to a technology-free zone for dinner. We just had to put all of our devices in another room, because even if they were in close proximity, we could hear them going off and they became a distraction. So just smartphones is one good example. They're great tools, but they make terrible appendages, as we all know.
Yeah.
Then the other I was going to point out was social media. The beautiful thing about social media, I mean, think about when Facebook came out 16 years ago. We have the ability to always know and be known. But the challenge with social media, as we all know, is that it provides the user an opportunity just to present selective information about their life. And so what happens is that user presents a faux reality and really misses out on living authentically. And so this is important because as a result of kind of this faux existence, they miss out on what community and life at its best can provide, which is being truly known and truly accepted and truly loved by others for who they really are, just as God loves them. And so those changes, they were fantastic for us on so multiple fronts, but they also came with corresponding downsides that have really impacted our ability to connect meaningfully, which means I think we're in an era where we're having to literally train and retrain people on the art of connection and presence and meaningful relationship.
I'm so glad you talked about that. And Bill, I've known you for a long time. You and I think I can safely say, have a good pre-digital memory, right? Like we remember this. You wrote a book, really. I mean, there were Blackberries in 2004, but they aren't nearly what even a super cheap smartphone is today. And I'm wondering about the impact of technology on being known and knowing others. And I want to ask you about that, Libby, because if you think about this, the 35-year-old leader today was 19 when Creating Community Edition 1 was released, which is a little sobering if you're my age. It's like, really? Because I remember that was being released. Like, but we now have like people who are well into their adult years who really don't have much of a pre-digital memory as adults. Libby, how is that impacting the way people connect with each other?
I think one of the bigger things is the attention span. Our attention spans have changed and diminished. And one of the things that we found in groups is that means that the group duration time has shortened. And it also means that their ability to connect in certain studies, we've used to have 12-week studies. We've now reduced it to about 3 to 4 weeks of studies to be able to keep people to connect. So I think our attention spans is one of the places that it's taken the biggest hit.
So can you say more about that? That's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I remember, I think it was 2006. I did a 22-week study on Revelation. And then there are other people, there are other preaching models, like my friend Mark Clark in Vancouver. He preached on the Gospel of Matthew recently for like, I think 3 years. And, he's got a church of 5,000 or 6,000 people. So it's not a small church, but why is that? Is that attendance rates? Is that like, oh, we couldn't make it for half the series? Or is it that people really can't hold a thought that long? What is behind the shorter curriculum?
On the group side of things, I have found that the members just don't stay connected with the study. They start disconnecting with it about midway through if you go too much beyond 3 to 4 weeks in a study.
Man.
Yeah.
Wow. And you're the director of women's groups. So what particularly have you seen? I mean, I don't want to gender stereotype, but women historically, I think the data would show are more likely to attend church, more likely to be involved in community, more likely to stay relationally connected, probably more likely to have deep and meaningful friendships that many men are. And there are exceptions to that rule. What are you discovering among women in particular, Libby, over the last few years? What are you seeing there, positive and negative?
I think the positive side is what you just said, is that even over time, even since last time that Bill wrote the book, our women's groups tend to be doing really well. And even during COVID, the pandemic, and when we were isolated and had to be at home, the women's groups continued to stay connected and wanted to be connected. I think our married groups took more of a hit and our men's groups took a little bit more of a hit. But on the women's side, they want to be connected. And so I think it's more of the, how do we help them to connect? What does that look like? How can we help get them creative? Do we use digital platforms? How can we help set up where they can meet outside? How can we brainstorm some of the different ideas and things like that? On the negative side, and I think Bill touched on this, is that we have lost how to connect with people. We have lost meaningful conversations, and we aren't used to being in hard conversations and connections. And so a lot of times we'll leave as opposed to stick when things get difficult or tough.
Yeah, I apologize to anyone who follows my material through the different channels because I'm going to go on a frequent subject of mine, but I'd love your take on it. My wife, Tony, and I have noticed what I call the death of conversation. Used to be conversation was mutual. It was like, Bill, how are you doing? What's up? Libby, tell me more about yourself, etc. It's kind of a volley back and forth. And I am shocked at the number of times we'll be out in a social setting with really wonderful, well-meaning people and never get asked a question. I've talked about that with Gordon McDonald. He's noticed that. Is that what you mean by the death of conversation, that we don't know how to have conversation? I think sometimes we now do social media updates in front of other people. In other words, I see Bill, it's like, well, here's what I did last Thursday. Here's what I did last Friday. Here's what I did on the weekend. Here's what I'm interested in. Boom, stop, period, end of sentence. No engagement. Like, what do you mean by the death of conversation? Because this is a passion point of mine.
I think it's just what you're saying. We don't know how to interact anymore. And we do updates. We have a tendency to overtalk. We have a tendency to want to fix people. Some of the just normal things that probably would, the edges that would have gotten rubbed off, if you're around community all the time, just haven't happened. And so we've got some people that get into group and behave badly, so it's one you have to be able to, and that's one of the things we try to do. And I love the systems that we have in place to set our leaders up well to help them with those conversations. A lot of what Bill put in the book is exactly what we do and what we try to inform our leaders on to set them up. Asking good questions is one of my favorite things that we do as far as training our leaders, because it teaches them, hey, I'm going to listen and I'm going to ask good questions as opposed to try to fix everything. And when you can ask a good question, people lean in. And people feel cared for. People feel like they want to be connected to you. And that's one of the main things that you can do as a leader.
So is it a certain sense in which when you train group leaders well, you're actually giving them some life skills and social skills that perhaps the culture has sucked out of the ether? Bill, what do you think about that? Is that
I think definitely, Carey. I think we're at a place where we're teaching or training as much on posture as we are in practice. We talk about the posture of a leader a lot. We say the posture of an effective leader is somebody who's humble, who's teachable, who's curious, and intentional. Now, notice what we didn't say. They're knowledgeable. We didn't say they have strong opinions. I think one of the things that we've lost is the art of curiosity. People, I think, are feeling so maxed out that they don't have in their minds capacity for what relationship requires. And so I loved your conversations when John Mark Comer, and I just think so much of the hurriedness of life is the great destroyer of relationship. And so one of the great answers is, if you really want to be an effective person who can meaningfully connect with other people, I was going to say leader, but it's really a person in general.
Human.
Yeah, human being. Then it's going to require a pace that is not what you're probably doing right now.
No, and this is interesting to me, because speaking about opinions, right? The church Tim Keller's talked about it on this podcast, has become very ideological, particularly over time, but really over the last year. Now, you guys are leading in Georgia. Talk about hotly contested elections. Talk about, you guys have been in the political center of the bullseye between left and right and QAnon and all that. This wasn't in the question set, so feel free, we can probably edit this out, but you've had to navigate that in groups. How do you because we talked to a lot of leaders, and it's like they discovered that their staff have really divergent views. And then you get together into a group situation, and this leader is an anti-vaxxer, and this one is for masks, and your group is divided. Have you had to wade into that territory, and how have you encouraged your leaders to moderate that kind of hyperpolarization?
Let me talk about our conversation today.
We had a conversation among the group life directors about masks, and masks optional. Do we want to put on the website about vaccinations? Is this something that we're going to step into? Do we want to step into it?
It is stepping into it, Libby. Yeah. So go ahead, keep going.
Yeah. No. Oh, let's backtrack just a little bit. November 2020, one of the things that we did was we did a training for our leaders, and it was called Tough Conversations. And it basically talked about everything that's under the water, because when you wade into a conversation, you're looking at what you're seeing, not realizing there's all these other things that are under the water. And so when you step in and all of a sudden you get the reaction that's up here, up at a 10 level, you're like, whoa, what did I just step on? And so if we can set the group leaders up for, okay, what do you do? How do you navigate that? How do you respond to a 10 reaction in a way that can help diffuse what's going on behind that, so that you don't have to take it personally, and kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit so they feel more confident being able to step into those places. But yeah, I think that
can you give us a few tips, because we're all like, our notebooks are open, so like train me. I'm a group leader.
That's
How
right.
do I do that when I'm like, hey, would everyone put your masks on, or would you take your masks off, right? Because it can be, as Lisa Turkhurst has said, when it's hysterical, it's historical. There's something there. You're right. You're stepping. It's not about the masks.
Yeah.
It's about something way deeper than that. What do you do in a situation like that? How do you have healthy dialogue without creating a Hatfields and McCoy church situation?
Yeah, I think Bill hit on it earlier, is the posture of a leader is a big one, is when you start off with curiosity. Sounds like there's a lot of emotion there. Can you tell me a little bit more? Just being able to step into that, being humble that you don't necessarily have the right answer, being teachable, realize that your way isn't the only way, being intentional with how you set up the group so it can be safe. I think common ground, finding common ground in the midst of all that, if it does get a little escalated, bringing everyone back to, hey, we all love Jesus, same team. That's one of the things that we get to do as well. So those are just a few. And yeah, we've got actually on our groupleaders.org website some tricks and tips to help, especially in the political season. So.
Okay. And is that publicly available?
It sure is.
Where would you find it? I'm just curious, because leaders would love to discover that. Is it just
So
northpoint.org?
it actually is, the website is groupleaders.org.
Groupleaders.org. Okay, that's great. Bill, any thoughts on de-escalating that kind of political, ideological stuff? And again, if your church is reaching the world, you're going to have Democrats and Republicans and independents and, vaccinated people and anti-vaxxers. And I mean, you're reaching the world. And, we haven't even touched on the racial trauma America's in the midst of right now. So how do you de-escalate conversations while still having meaningful conversations?
Yeah, so we whether it was the political season, whether it was COVID, our campus is inside the perimeter, so inside the city. Definitely, we're much more blue, and our suburban churches were much more red. So it was not a one size fits all approach. And quite frankly, we frustrated people on both ends. We had people who were in the burbs who were saying, what's the problem? And we had people in the city, I can't even believe you guys would consider continuing even to have groups meet. So we allowed the campuses to make their own, choices in terms of what made most sense in their particular communities. But I think it goes back to purpose, highest good, and not forgetting that the secret sauce of the church has not always been well known. I mean, it's the uniqueness of our message, but it is in particular, the secret sauce for us has been the quality of relationships that we have with one another. And so going back and saying, okay, we have to agree, and maybe at this point to disagree, or we need to agree to suspend the conversation on this and move on to something. But it is not a fight to the finish, as many would like to bait you into. And I think we have to be willing to not take the bait sometimes as leaders, and be curious, ask questions. I can tell you're really upset about that. Be curious and just say, so what's behind that? What has made you have so much energy on this particular issue? And then let them talk, because sometimes always there's a story behind that emotion. And so letting them share that story, I think, is an important part of the process.
It's funny, in groups culture for decades, people have talked about the extra grace required person. And I wonder if we're in a season where we're all extra grace required people right now, or there's not just the one in your group, right? There's not just one in your group anymore.
That's right.
Okay. Let's talk about the pandemic's impact on groups. So like everybody, you pivoted to almost all virtual overnight. And you probably, I know North Point's experimented off and on, North Point Ministries, with virtual groups for years. But the vast majority of your groups were in person, right? Prior to COVID?
Yeah.
So you pivoted with the rest of the planet to virtual. What did you learn about virtual relationships versus in-person relationships over the last year and a half?
Well, Libby and I can both tell you, we have not cracked the nut on this one. So we'll be very clear. We're going to tell you some of the things we learned, some of the things we tried, some of the abject failures that we had along the way, for sure. But I think we've found out that leveraging platforms like Zoom, especially in the short term, can really work well. I mean, we were able to pivot in the height of COVID or the early stages of COVID, the vast majority of our groups to a digital platform, and they were able to stay and engage meaningfully for an extended period of time. It really was something to behold. But we did find that there is a Zoom fatigue that goes with it. And people want to be in close proximity. And so as soon as the weather, and I love to joke with my Canadian friends on a regular basis because our weather starts to turn in late February. And you guys are still getting inundated with snow. So it's,
we're still digging ourselves out.
That's right.
Thanks.
But I mean, yeah, if it's 55 degrees, we had groups that were meeting in person, but outside, socially distanced, just so they could be in close proximity. And so there's a great success rate, I would say, but there is a shelf life in terms of what people want. People want to be with each other. And now we tried a couple of things. I mean, one of our campuses did some short-term digital connections using some, I think one was marriage content and one was, I think around anxiety, and had some great success on connecting some of the disconnected. So that was effective. But being an on-ramp into long-term community, that was really tricky for us. We tried Facebook ads. We tried to do some other things for disconnected people, and we just weren't successful.
So on-ramping new people into groups has proved really difficult because of digital, or just because we're still somehow in, Delta variant is surging and all that? Like, are you finding it difficult to do that both digitally and in person? Like, is that just a season thing?
I think we were in Libby, you jump in, but I think we were effective at creating the short-term content that people would engage with for like 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah.
But once that 3 or 4 weeks came and went, the idea of staying connected with a group of people to continue on a journey just did not have the same staying power that we had pre-COVID. And so, and I think we've been averaging somewhere about 35-40% of what we typically would connect in our short-term and long-term groups. And it's just, I think that's COVID, but I think, it's just been a challenging.
Community took a hit. Took a hit so far. Yeah. Libby, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I found one of the areas that seemed to do better on the digital platform, and this was surprising to me, is my older women's groups. And part of the reason for that was they weren't allowed, a lot of them were health compromised and weren't able to get out. So this was their only community that they were experiencing. And they just latched on with both hands. In fact, I've got several groups that had started in March of 2020 that are still going digitally just because they can't meet in person yet. And they do a lot of extra things on the side. And I think it's the extra things on the side that actually kept them connected. One of my group leaders sent little care packages to the people throughout the week. They made sure that they had outside check-ins and just really did more of life together, and built in some fun where they did like scavenger hunts and things like that. So I think Bill's 100% right that, we've taken a hit. It's been fun to see how, while we've got the ideal, how people have adapted to the real and been able to really experience some good community in a time that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
Let's talk about generations for a moment. It's interesting because as you're discussing that, Libby, I'm thinking about my parents. My dad's like 81. My mom's a couple of years younger, and they're part of a small group, and like they've hung in there on Zoom. But my perception would say younger adults have had a much harder time staying connected. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing, we had Shane Sanchez on. He talked a little bit about trying to keep students connected from Gwinnett Church. What are you seeing with the generations? Is it harder on one generation than another to sort of stay engaged in community in this season? What are you seeing, Libby? Start with you.
Yeah, on the women's side, it does feel like there's two, and I think it's need-based. I think it's not necessarily generationally. I think it's need-based. Some of my mom groups have stayed connected despite everything, because it has been absolutely crazy with the kids at home and things like that. But it has been their lifeblood, to be able to stay connected, and that's in this season. And then my older women's groups seem to do really well too. I think it's the middle ones that have the other options that
teenagers, empty nesters.
Yeah.
What about singles? What are you seeing in singles?
Singles stayed connected as well, at least it over with me. That was one of the things that, as they didn't have other places, especially when we were quarantined, this was their only outlet. And so it was a lifeline to them, because some of the people worked from home. Like if you were working from home and you didn't have any other connection, that was it. That was the person that was on the Zoom call with you. That was it.
We have, Carey, two kinds of groups that really deal with people in transition. We have just grad groups. So these are for young adults who have just graduated from college. Then we've got some just married groups, which are the biggest blast in the world. They're all newlywed couples. And so, if you lead one of those, you'll never go back to your peer-led group again, because they're just so much.
I immediately
so much
sat
fun.
up. It's like, can I lead one of those? That sounds like fun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the thing that I think made during this season, they had a felt need. They were either transitioning into a city or they were transitioning into a new season of life. And that felt need really drove the need for connection. And so they stayed connected. In fact, many of them were really pushing for more embodied community, live community, and willing to take risks rather than stay digital, which I found very interesting. But they had so enjoyed that early experience pre-COVID. We do a connection event in January. COVID hit in March, so they had just started to get going. And they were pretty rabid about staying together and staying connected, but they had that felt need.
So moving into the fall, here we are, all the leaders listening are kind of planning for the fall, wondering what's ahead. And it's easy to think that mega churches are exempt from problems, but give us an idea of, if you're listening, you just saw them both laugh. The problems just get bigger, right, Bill? Right.
That's
Libby?
right.
Attendance, maybe, is it fair to say, is not where it was pre-COVID? You haven't seen a deluge back, like you've been open now since Easter.
Yeah.
But are you batting 30%, 50%? Where are you roughly at with your attendance?
Attendance is running between 40 and 50% of where we were pre-COVID. Student ministry is up a little bit over that.
Wow.
KidMin is running close to that. Our preschool area, Wombaland, is not even close to that, because again, they're the most vulnerable. So people have been hesitant to put their babies into preschool areas. Yeah. But, the connection, we just don't know what to expect, especially with the Delta variant. We're probably looking at right now about a third of the typical connections that we'd make in this fall season we'll make this year.
Wow.
And so it's major difference.
How do you navigate the emotions of that?
Well, we've had, 2 connection seasons to do that in COVID. And one of the biggest things is just reminding our team, let's make sure that the people who are taking the step are finding a great experience. Let's make sure that we're helping onboard new groups, new group leaders, and their members well. So we're putting a lot of touch points in the first 90 days of a new group, just to make sure that that initial experience, we've created 3-month tracks for them to do. So again, guesswork is out. We're doing a lot of hand holding just to make sure that this experience in very unique times is still a really good one.
So
It's just
what does
taking a
that
lot more
mean?
effort.
And feel free to chime in, Libby. You're checking in more with group leaders. You say touch points. What? Because that's very intuitive. This is where you need more contact, not less, from your leaders. What specifically are you doing as you head into the fall?
Yeah, Libby?
One of the things that Bill mentioned is, especially with new leaders, is making sure that we have multiple touch points. We have an initial training that just right out of the gate, adults learn as they need to know things. And so that's where we try to meet them. And so we try to space them out. And so we've got the initial one, and then 6 weeks later, we do one that's like, hey, how's it going? And we do scenarios and have the opportunity just to step into any spaces that may have shifted or changed. One of the things that with Zoom that has shifted, that has been really helpful, and we've been able to just leverage, is just throw up a Zoom huddle and, hey, do y'all have any questions? Hey, the masks are coming out again. Let's talk about it. And you can get 10 to 12 leaders on a Zoom call and just make sure that they feel comfortable stepping into the spaces. And I love that too, because they get to hear from other leaders, so they don't feel like they're alone. It normalizes some of their thoughts, their ideas, their concerns, and they get to hear amazing ideas that I could not come up with. And so just being able to use those small little touch points along the way is really helpful.
I like what you're saying. I don't know, this is editorializing, but one thing I've found, we're in the middle of a big personal project in our backyard. What I long for more than anything is not email. I want to talk to somebody or see somebody, or even like, if you would call me, if the shipment's going to be delayed, would someone just give me a phone call? We'll talk voice to voice or jump on a Zoom call. And I know we're all tired of Zoom, blah, 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 but you don't have to drive into the building. You don't have to sit socially distanced, and you can just do a quick 30-minute call that you can squeeze in your life. I think those are great ideas, personal touch. Anything else that you're really paying attention to as you head into this fall, trying to connect humans to humans, which is the essence of the church, really?
Well, can we talk about staff? Because it can
let's.
be a major bummer, right? To go into a connection season when you've used to have this level of engagement and you've got this level of engagement. And so reminding our staff that these people who are taking steps, that this is a unique time. So let's kind of dial down the euphoria about numbers, and let's dial up stories about people who are having meaningful group experiences. And so I think that's been important. We've tried to connect more as staff. I know many of our campuses are doing these in-between service touch points with leaders, just to try to create not just training, but life on life, flesh on flesh engagements, so that people can have conversations and level of connection, and that it's personal, not just organizational.
Well, this has been encouraging, the end, and I really want to thank you for your candor, and also to underscore something you both said. It reminded me of a time where I was discouraged about who wasn't in the room. But I think in this season, you just got to focus on who is in the room or who is watching, right, not on those who aren't, because you can get so obsessed about the people who aren't in the room that you will ignore the people who are in the room. And that's a really, really good reminder. So Bill, anything else you want to say about the brand new edition, really the new book, Creating Community, you and Andy redid? You said it was 80% new at this point, basically.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It was a COVID project, so it was a lot of fun to do when we had a lot of isolated time. But I just think it goes back to, we talk a lot about the need for community, and however a church does it, and however their connection strategy, I just think it's so important to remember that community is not an optional value. It's hopefully a way of life for people. Group is a human construct that we're trying to connect people into, so they can make those relationships and experience real community. But community, I hope, is a lifelong value for churches and for church leaders forever, personally, and I hope also for their organizations, because we need other people to help us grow, and other people need us to help them grow. And together, something beautiful happens when we come together under the banner of Christ and invite him to be in our midst. Growth happens, change happens, and again, as I said earlier, it's the secret sauce. It's the distinguishing mark. You know, I think it's real important to remember that Jesus did not say it was the emblems on our cars, it was the t-shirt images that we wore, it was the passion of our worship, or even the theology. But he said it was the unique way we connected with one another. And I just hope that's always that we're reminded, and we remember that the distinguishing mark of the church is the unique way they relate to one another, not the frequency of meeting or the content in which we gather around.
Libby, final thought today for leaders?
Oh goodness, what you're doing is worthy work. It is, as Bill started the conversation today, with 61% or over 50% of people feeling lonely and without meaningful connections. Meaningful connections are more important than they've ever been. And as we get to step into those spaces, it's holy ground, and that we get to be a part of it is absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, it's worthy work. Keep it up.
I'll just finish this. My wife's on the prayer team, and we were on a long ride, and she was praying through some of the things that came in. And if you really see what people are praying about on a prayer line, like they're lonely, they're frustrated, their marriage isn't going the way they want it to, they're addicted. And in isolation, all those problems just get worse. So thank you so much for being committed to community in a difficult season. I say that to you, Bill, to you, Libby, but also to every leader here. It's not just content. It's not just watching. It's not just consumption. It's life on life connection, connection to Christ, connection to each other. So the book, brand new pretty much, is called Creating Community with Andy Stanley and Bill Willits. Make sure you pick up the 2021 edition. Thank you so much, leaders, for tuning into this episode of Church Pulse Weekly. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. Let us know if you want us to cover any subjects or anything. Hit us up on social, and make sure you sign up for the Activating Missions Barna Collab. It's a 6-week learning cohort designed to help you figure out how to prepare your church for an impactful missions future. As a podcast listener, you get 15% off by using the promo code ChurchPulse15. Go to barna.com/collab to learn more. Thanks so much, Bill and Libby, and leaders. Have a great week. We'll catch